Hey guys, when we picture peasants, we usually imagine poverty, mud, and hard work from sunrise to dark. But the quiet detail that tells you the most about their lives is simpler than castles or battles. It's what they ate every ordinary day and what they couldn't eat even when they desperately wanted to. The peasant diet wasn't just survival food. It was a map of power, climate, faith, and constant negotiation with the seasons. And if you enjoy calm, long-form history that treats everyday life as seriously as kings and wars, consider subscribing. A lot of regular listeners do, simply so they don't miss the next deep dive. And it helps these slower, more thoughtful stories find the people who actually want them. To understand what peasants ate daily, we have to start by dropping one modern assumption. There was no standard meal plan. Even within medieval Europe, where the word peasant most often lands in the imagination, daily food depended on region, soil, access to woodland or river, the demands of a landlord, the rules of the church calendar, and the ever-present question of whether last year's harvest was still holding. But there was a pattern, and once you see it, you can almost hear the rhythm of an agricultural year in the kitchen pot. For most peasants, most of the time, the center of the diet was grain. Not as a side dish, not as a quaint rustic loaf, but as the basic unit of calories, the thing that kept bodies moving through repetitive labor. Grain became bread, and it became porridge, and it became the thick, steady dish that appears across sources in different names. Pottage. If you want a single answer to the question, what did peasants eat daily? It often begins with a pot hanging over the hearth, simmering whatever could be spared. That pot wasn't fancy, but it was efficient. It allowed small amounts of ingredients to feed many mouths, it could be reheated across days, and it turned tough plants into something edible. Bread mattered, but not the way modern bread does. For a wealthier household, bread might be pale and fine, made from well-sifted wheat. For a peasant family, bread was often darker, heavier, and made from mixtures. Rye, barley, oats, peas, beans, and whatever grain could be grown or obtained. The quality shifted with luck and with status. In years of strain, flour might stretch further by adding more pulses. In worse years, it might be bulked out with whatever was at hand, and people remembered those years not as abstract bad harvests, but as the time when bread became unfamiliar, coarser, smaller, more bitter, and more carefully rationed. Then there was ale. Not ale as a luxury, but ale as a daily drink. Water could be unsafe depending on local conditions, and even when it wasn't, daily work demanded calories and hydration. Small beer or weak ale, low in alcohol compared to modern expectations, was common in many regions. Brewing at home was part of domestic labor, often managed by women, and it turned grain into a drink that stored, traveled, and nourished. When we say peasants relied on grain, it's worth remembering that grain wasn't only baked. It was boiled, fermented, and converted into something that could be carried into fields or consumed quickly between tasks. A typical day's eating might start early, but not always with what we'd call breakfast. Morning food could be light, especially during intense work seasons when every minute mattered. People might take a piece of bread, perhaps dipped in broth or accompanied by a small amount of cheese or onions. Midday, when the body needed fuel, was often the main meal. and the evening meal after work might return to pottage, bread, and whatever small extras were available. But these weren't fixed, clockwork meals. The farming calendar created its own schedule. During haymaking or harvest, when labor was relentless and daylight precious, the priority was portable food and enough calories to keep going. During winter, meals might be more repetitive, with fewer fresh ingredients and more reliance on stored grains, dried peas, salted goods, and whatever could be kept from spoiling. Vegetables and greens filled the gaps, and this is where the daily reality becomes vivid. Many peasant households kept small gardens, sometimes informal, sometimes attached to the home, where hardy plants could be grown. Onions, leeks, garlic, cabbages, and herbs. These weren't garnish. They were crucial. They added flavor, they added nutrients, and they made grain-based meals tolerable day after day. Wild foods mattered too, not in the romantic foraging lifestyle sense, but as practical supplements. Berries in season, nuts where available, edible greens, mushrooms carefully, because knowledge of what was safe mattered. In some places, access to woodland and common land made the difference between a diet that merely survived and one that occasionally felt abundant. Protein is where the modern imagination tends to overcorrect. We either picture peasants as constantly starving, or we imagine a hearty rustic table with meat and cheese in abundance. The truth sits in the middle, and it changes by region and by season. Meat was not absent, but it was not daily for many households. Animals were valuable alive. A cow gave milk, a chicken gave eggs, an ox pulled the plow. Killing an animal meant sacrificing an ongoing source of labor or food. So when meat appeared, it often did so at particular moments. Festivals, weddings, occasional market purchases, or the autumn slaughter when animals that could not be overwintered were killed and preserved. Dairy deserves a closer look because it tells you something about practicality. Fresh milk spoils quickly, so turning it into cheese, butter, or curds was a way of storing calories. In some regions, dairy could be a steady part of the diet. In others, access was limited by what animals a household could afford or by obligations to a lord, who might claim certain produce as rent or due. Even then, small amounts of cheese could appear as a working food, portable, dense, and filling, especially in communities where pastoral life mattered as much as farming. Fish complicates the story in an important way: religion. In Christian medieval Europe, the calendar was full of fasting days, times when certain foods, especially meat, were restricted. Whatever the exact local practice, the effect was the same. Demand for fish increased and people adapted. Coastal peasants, river communities, and those near lakes had more routine access to fish. Inland, fish might be salted and traded, and it could become a regular feature not because it was cheap, but because it fit the rules and the rhythms that govern the year. This is one of those details where daily diet is shaped by institutions. Faith wasn't only a private belief. It was a schedule that reached into kitchens. Now, none of this meant that peasants were always well-fed. In fact, the everyday diet is most revealing when you consider what happened when the system faltered. A peasant economy lived close to its margins. Harvest failure, war disruption, or a harsh winter could turn daily meals into careful arithmetic. The pot still simmered, but it was thinner. Bread was smaller. Grain stores were watched with a new kind of anxiety because the future was not a concept. It was a physical pile of food in a bin, and once it was gone, the options narrowed quickly. In lean periods, people leaned harder on legumes, on wild foods, on anything that could be ground into flour. They also relied on community when possible. Shared ovens, shared labor, and the informal safety nets of neighbors and kin, all under the shadow of rents and obligations that did not necessarily shrink just because harvests did. The daily diet also carried a quiet social hierarchy within peasantry itself. Not all peasants were the same. Some held more land, had more animals, and could store more food. Some were laborers with little or no land, working for others and living more precariously. The difference could show up in simple things: more wheat bread versus more rye, more cheese versus none, occasional meat versus almost never. Even the seasoning mattered. Salt, for example, was essential for preserving food and adding taste, but it was not always easy or cheap. A diet can look similar from a distance: grain, greens, ale, but feel very different in comfort depending on those small margins. What's striking when you step back is how daily peasant food was less a menu than a set of strategies. Boil what you have, stretch what you can, preserve in season for the time when nothing grows. Use grain in every form possible: bread for carrying, porridge for volume, ale for hydration and calories. Add greens and onions for flavor and health. Rely on beans and peas because they store well and feed many. Save animals because animals are wealth. Slaughter when you must. Trade when you can. Follow the calendar because the calendar is not optional. And in that sense, the peasant diet becomes a documentary about the medieval world itself. It shows you the dominance of agriculture, the fragility of the food supply, the power of landlords and markets, the presence of religion in daily routine, and the way ordinary people built resilient systems without modern technology. The pot of pottage isn't just a food item. It's a symbol of continuity, an everyday answer to the question of how you keep going when life is repetitive, uncertain, and physically demanding. If you listen closely, you can almost hear that hearth. The scrape of a spoon against a wooden bowl, the quiet trade of bread between hands, the small relief of warmth in winter, the steady repetition of meals that didn't try to impress anyone, only to sustain them. And for most peasants, that was the point. Their daily food was not about variety. It was about making tomorrow possible. As we continue looking at what peasants actually ate each day, it becomes clear that the daily meal was shaped just as much by the seasons as by the ingredients themselves. Medieval rural life followed a strict agricultural rhythm, and food availability rose and fell with that cycle. What appeared in the pot in summer could look very different from what simmered there in the depths of winter. Spring was often the most difficult period of the year. By this time, the grain stores from the previous harvest were running low, and fresh crops were still weeks away from being ready. Historians sometimes refer to this period as the hungry gap. The daily pottage might be thinner, the bread smaller, and families had to stretch whatever remained of their stored food. Wild greens became especially important during these months. Nettles, sorrel, dandelion leaves, and other early plants could be gathered and added to soups or stews. These greens helped fill stomachs and also restored nutrients after a long winter diet dominated by grains and dried foods. Summer gradually improved the situation. Gardens and small plots began producing fresh vegetables. Cabbages, peas, beans, onions, and herbs. For peasants fortunate enough to have a small dairy animal, summer also meant a steadier supply of milk. Fresh cheese and butter might appear more often during these warmer months. However, summer also demanded intense labor in the fields, which meant meals had to provide enough energy for long hours of physical work. Bread and ale remained the dependable foundation of daily calories. Autumn was the most hopeful season. Harvest time meant new grain, and with it came a sense of temporary security. Fresh bread made from newly milled flour could replace the darker loaves made from old stores. Vegetables were plentiful, and communities prepared carefully for the coming winter. This was also the season when many animals were slaughtered. Keeping large numbers of animals through the winter required feed that most peasant households simply didn't have. Instead, animals such as pigs were killed, and the meat was preserved through salting, smoking, or drying. While this meat would not necessarily appear every day on the table, autumn was often the moment when households could enjoy richer meals before preservation began. Winter then returned the diet to simplicity. Fresh vegetables were scarce unless they could be stored, and the pot returned again to grains, legumes, and preserved foods. Dried peas and beans became especially important, providing protein that could last for months. Root vegetables such as turnips or stored cabbages might still appear in stews. The meals were repetitive, but they were dependable, and dependability mattered far more than variety. Cooking itself also reveals something important about daily peasant life. Most households did not have elaborate kitchens. The central feature was usually a hearth, an open fire used for warmth, light, and cooking. A large pot could hang over this fire, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. New ingredients were simply added as they became available. Yesterday's pottage might become today's meal with the addition of a handful of beans or a chopped onion. Because fuel, especially firewood, required effort to gather, cooking methods favored long simmering rather than repeated small preparations. A single pot feeding an entire household made practical sense. It also meant that meals were shared experiences. The family gathered around the same pot, dipping bread into the broth or scooping food into simple wooden bowls. In many ways, the daily food of peasants was shaped by efficiency. Every ingredient had to justify the labor required to produce it. Crops that grew reliably and stored well became the foundation of survival. Meals were designed to stretch resources while still providing enough energy to endure the constant demands of agricultural work. Yet within this simplicity there was also knowledge built over generations. Peasants understood how to combine foods to make them sustaining, how to preserve harvests for months, and how to adapt when conditions changed. Their diet may appear repetitive to modern eyes, but it was the product of careful adaptation to land, climate, and community. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that history is not only written in castles and battlefields. It is also written quietly in kitchens, in fields, and in the humble pot that fed millions of ordinary people day after day. Another important piece of the peasant diet was something many people today rarely think about when imagining medieval food: legumes. Beans, peas, and lentils were some of the most dependable sources of protein available to rural families. Unlike meat, which required animals and resources, legumes could be grown directly in the fields or gardens and stored for long periods without spoiling. Dried peas and broad beans were especially common across much of medieval Europe. After harvest, they could be dried and kept in sacks for months, sometimes even through the entire winter. When added to pottage, they thickened the broth and provided a filling texture that helped replace the calories and nutrients meat might otherwise supply. A pot of grain and vegetables might keep a person going, but adding beans or peas made the meal far more sustaining. This reliance on legumes also reflected agricultural practicality. Many of these plants helped improve soil quality by returning nutrients to the earth. Farmers understood this benefit even if they did not describe it in modern scientific terms. Rotating crops with peas or beans helped fields remain productive, and that meant better harvests in the following seasons. In that way, legumes supported both the land and the people who depended on it. Bread, however, still remained the defining daily food. But even here, the details are more interesting than they might first appear. Medieval bread was rarely uniform. The type of grain available depended heavily on geography. In colder northern regions, rye and oats grew more reliably than wheat. In other areas, barley was common. Wheat bread, the pale, soft loaf often associated with medieval imagery, was typically more expensive and more often consumed by wealthier households. For peasants, bread might be dense, dark, and sometimes mixed with other ingredients to stretch the flour supply. In difficult years, small amounts of ground peas or beans could be added to the dough. This produced loaves that were heavier but also more nutritious. Bread was often baked in communal ovens owned by the village or the local lord. Families prepared their dough at home and then brought it to the oven to be baked, sometimes paying a small fee for its use. Once baked, bread served many purposes beyond simply being eaten. Thick slices could act almost like utensils. Instead of forks or spoons, pieces of bread were used to scoop up stew or soak up broth from the bottom of a bowl. In some cases, large pieces of stale bread called trenchers served as edible plates. After absorbing the juices of a meal, these trenchers could be eaten or sometimes given to the poor or to animals. Flavor, too, played a quiet but important role in everyday meals. While peasant food is often imagined as bland, herbs grown in small gardens added variety. Parsley, thyme, sage, and dill could be used in cooking when available. Garlic and onions were especially valued because they grew easily and stored well. These ingredients added depth to simple stews and helped transform basic grains and vegetables into meals that were far more satisfying. Salt was another critical element, though it was not always easy to obtain. Salt preserved meat and fish, but it also made otherwise plain food far more enjoyable. In regions far from salt sources, obtaining it could require trade or payment, which meant households used it carefully. All of these small details, the legumes simmering in the pot, the heavy bread baked in a village oven, the herbs from a garden patch, help form a clearer picture of daily life. The peasant diet was not luxurious, but it was built from ingredients that were dependable, adaptable, and deeply tied to the rhythms of land and labor. And through these meals, repeated day after day, generation after generation, ordinary people sustained the entire structure of medieval society. One aspect of the peasant diet that often surprises modern viewers is how strongly religious rules shaped daily meals. In medieval Europe, the Christian calendar contained a large number of fasting days. These were not rare events limited to a few holidays. In many communities, people were expected to avoid certain foods for well over 100 days each year. The most well-known fasting season was Lent, the 40 days leading up to Easter, but there were also weekly fasting days, often on Fridays, as well as numerous smaller observances scattered throughout the year. During these times, the rules generally restricted the consumption of meat from land animals. Dairy products and eggs were sometimes limited as well, depending on the specific tradition of the region. This meant that the everyday peasant diet had to adapt frequently. Grain-based meals such as bread and pottage remained unchanged, but protein sources shifted. Instead of pork or beef, people relied more heavily on fish, legumes, and vegetables. Fish therefore became an important part of the medieval food system, even for communities located far from the sea. Coastal villages had the advantage of fresh catches, but inland regions depended on preserved fish. Salted or dried fish could be transported long distances and stored for extended periods. Herring, for example, became one of the most widely traded fish in medieval Northern Europe. Large fishing industries developed in response to the demand created by religious fasting. Rivers and lakes also played a role. Many peasant communities lived close to waterways where fishing could supplement the household diet. Simple traps, nets, and lines allowed families to catch species such as carp, pike, or eels. These fish might appear in stews or be roasted over a fire. While fish was not always available every day, the regular fasting schedule meant that people were accustomed to relying on it whenever possible. Religion influenced food in other ways too. Certain feast days allowed richer meals, and these moments stood out strongly against the simplicity of ordinary life. On major celebrations such as Christmas or Easter, even poorer households might enjoy dishes that rarely appeared during the rest of the year. A small portion of meat, a better loaf of bread made with finer flour, or sweetened foods prepared with honey could transform an otherwise modest table into something memorable. These feasts mattered because they broke the monotony of everyday meals. When most days consisted of similar combinations of grain, vegetables, and legumes, special occasions created powerful memories. Food became part of celebration, community gatherings, and religious observance. Villagers might share meals after church services or during seasonal festivals tied to the agricultural calendar. But despite these occasional moments of abundance, the daily reality returned quickly to practicality. Peasants had to plan their food carefully, especially because storage was always a challenge. Without refrigeration, preserving food required skill and preparation. Drying, salting, smoking, and fermenting were essential techniques that allowed food harvested in one season to be eaten months later. Cabbage, for instance, could be fermented into early forms of sauerkraut in some regions, allowing it to last much longer than fresh vegetables. Meat preserved with salt could survive the winter if stored properly. Grains, when kept dry and protected from pests, could remain edible for extended periods. These methods were not luxuries, they were survival strategies. Storage spaces themselves were simple but effective. Grain might be kept in wooden bins or sacks raised slightly off the ground to protect against moisture and rodents. Root vegetables could be stored in cool cellars or buried pits where temperatures remain stable. Even the design of peasant homes sometimes reflected the need to store food safely through long winters. When we look closely at these practices, we begin to see how carefully organized the peasant food system really was. Every harvest, every preserved fish, every stored sack of grain represented security for the coming months. Meals might appear simple on the surface, but they were supported by a network of knowledge about farming, preservation, and seasonal planning. The daily bowl of pottage, the coarse loaf of bread, the occasional fish stew. These foods formed the quiet foundation of medieval life. They fueled the labor that built fields, maintained villages, and supported the broader society above them. Kings and nobles may dominate historical records, but it was the steady, practical diet of peasants that sustained the population year after year. And in that sense, the story of what peasants ate each day is really the story of endurance, of ordinary people managing land, seasons, and resources with careful attention, ensuring that tomorrow's meal would still be possible. Another detail that helps us understand the daily diet of peasants is the role of small household animals. While large animals such as cattle or oxen were extremely valuable and rarely slaughtered casually, smaller animals often played a more regular part in rural food systems. Chickens, for example, were among the most practical animals a peasant family could keep. They required relatively little space, could feed on scraps or insects, and produced eggs that offered a reliable source of nutrition. Eggs did not always appear in large quantities, but when hens were laying well, they could be eaten boiled, mixed into simple dishes, or added to pottage to enrich the broth. During certain religious fasting periods, eggs might be avoided, but outside those restrictions, they were a valuable addition to the household diet. Even when eggs were not eaten immediately, they could sometimes be preserved for short periods using simple storage techniques. Pigs were another extremely important animal in many peasant communities. Unlike cattle, pigs could be raised without large grazing fields. They were often fed scraps, acorns, or forage from woodland areas. Because of this flexibility, pigs became a practical way for families to convert otherwise unused resources into food. When autumn arrived and winter approached, many households slaughtered their pigs. This event was not simply about one meal. It was about creating a food supply that could last for months. The meat from a slaughtered pig was carefully divided and preserved. Some cuts might be eaten fresh in the days immediately following the slaughter, often during communal gatherings where neighbors helped with the work. But most of the meat was salted, smoked, or cured. Bacon and salted pork could then be stored and used sparingly throughout the winter. Even small pieces added to a pot of beans or vegetables could transform the flavor of a meal. Nothing from the animal was wasted. Fat could be rendered into lard, which served both as a cooking fat and sometimes as a spread for bread. Bones might be boiled repeatedly to extract flavor for soups. Even less desirable parts of the animal could be turned into sausages or stews. This careful use of every part reflected the constant need to stretch resources as far as possible. Milk animals also shaped the diet where they were available. A cow or goat represented a steady supply of milk, which could be consumed fresh or turned into other foods. Fresh milk itself might not always be drunk directly, especially because it spoiled quickly. Instead, families often transformed it into butter, soft cheeses, or curds. These products lasted longer and were easier to store. Cheese, in particular, was extremely useful. It concentrated the nutrients of milk into a compact form that could travel well. A small piece of cheese carried into the fields could provide energy during long hours of labor. For peasants who spent much of their day working away from home, portable foods like bread and cheese made practical sense. What becomes clear through all these examples is that the peasant diet depended heavily on self-sufficiency at the household level. Markets certainly existed, and peasants did sometimes trade or purchase food, especially salt or occasional fish. But most daily meals were built from ingredients produced close to home. Grains grown in nearby fields, vegetables from small gardens, eggs from household chickens, or preserved meat from animals raised within the community. Even the act of cooking reflected this self-contained system. Many peasant homes had only a few simple tools: a large cooking pot, a wooden spoon, perhaps a small knife, and basic bowls made from wood or pottery. Elaborate cookware was unnecessary because most meals relied on boiling or simmering. The hearth fire remained the center of domestic life, providing warmth and a place where food could cook slowly over time. Children in these households learned about food from an early age. They helped gather firewood, collect eggs, weed garden beds, and sometimes assist in preparing meals. Knowledge about planting, harvesting, and preserving food passed naturally from one generation to the next. In this way, the daily diet was not only about nutrition, it was also part of the cultural memory of rural communities. And when historians study what peasants ate, they are really studying something larger than a menu. They are looking at a system of survival built on careful use of land, animals, labor, and tradition. The meals may have been simple, but they were the product of generations of experience. Knowledge that allowed millions of people to live, work, and endure within the demanding rhythms of medieval life. Another revealing part of the peasant diet comes from looking at the tools and methods used to prepare food, because these shaped what meals were even possible. Modern kitchens offer dozens of cooking techniques, but medieval peasants worked with a very small set of tools and a limited supply of fuel. As a result, the structure of daily meals became remarkably consistent across large regions. The heart of most homes was the open hearth. This was not only where food was cooked, but also where warmth and light came from. Above the fire, a metal or ceramic pot might hang from a hook or rest on simple supports. Into that pot went the ingredients that defined everyday eating: grain, vegetables, legumes, and occasionally small pieces of preserved meat. The long, slow simmer allowed tough ingredients to soften and flavors to blend together. Because maintaining a fire required effort, cooking tended to happen in ways that made the most efficient use of heat. A pot might remain over the fire for hours, sometimes with ingredients added gradually throughout the day. Yesterday's stew could be reheated and extended with fresh ingredients, creating a continuous cycle of cooking and eating. In this way, pottage was not just a dish but a flexible system that adapted to whatever food happened to be available. Bread baking, however, was usually handled differently. Most peasant homes did not have private ovens large enough for proper baking. Instead, villages often had communal ovens, sometimes owned by the local lord or maintained by the community. Families prepared their dough at home and then carried it to the oven to be baked alongside the loaves of their neighbors. This shared system allowed efficient use of fuel and ensured that even small households could bake bread. The communal oven also became a subtle social space. While waiting for bread to bake, villagers exchanged news, discussed work, or simply spent time together. In small rural communities, these interactions helped maintain relationships and cooperation. Food preparation, therefore, had a social dimension that extended beyond the household. Utensils were simple and practical. Wooden bowls and spoons were common because wood was easy to shape and widely available. Clay pottery was also used for cooking and storage. Metal objects existed but were more expensive, so households often owned only a few essential pieces. Forks, which are common in modern dining, were rarely used in peasant homes during much of the medieval period. Instead, people relied on spoons, knives, and pieces of bread to handle food. Dining itself was informal by modern standards. Families often shared food from the same pot or from a few large bowls. Bread might be broken and dipped into stew, absorbing the broth and making the meal more filling. This shared approach reflected both practicality and the close structure of rural households. Another important element in daily food preparation was preservation knowledge. Because harvest seasons produced large amounts of food at once, peasants had to find ways to make those supplies last through the winter months. Drying grains and legumes was relatively straightforward, but vegetables and meats required more careful methods. Smoking meat over a slow fire helped prevent spoilage while also adding flavor. Salting meat or fish removed moisture that bacteria needed to grow. Vegetables could be stored in cool underground spaces or fermented to extend their usefulness. Each of these methods required experience, and mistakes could lead to spoiled food, a serious problem when supplies were limited. Herbs and small flavorings also had roles beyond taste. Certain plants were believed to help preserve foods or improve digestion. Whether these beliefs were scientifically accurate or not, they reflected centuries of observation about how different ingredients behaved in cooking. When we combine all these details, the hearth cooking, communal ovens, simple utensils, and preservation techniques, we begin to see how daily peasant meals were shaped by practical constraints. People cooked what they could grow, using methods that required minimal tools and fuel. Variety existed, but it was limited by the realities of rural life. Yet within those limitations, peasant communities developed a surprisingly stable food culture. Recipes were rarely written down, but knowledge passed through practice. A child watching a parent stir the pot or knead bread absorbed skills that had been refined across generations. So when we imagine what peasants ate each day, it is helpful to picture not just the food itself but the entire environment surrounding it. The smoky hearth, the shared oven, the steady rhythm of stirring and baking. These quiet routines formed the foundation of everyday life for millions of people, sustaining societies long before modern kitchens or global food systems ever existed. As we look deeper into the daily diet of peasants, it also becomes important to understand how geography quietly reshaped what daily food actually meant. While historians often speak broadly about medieval peasants, the ingredients available to a rural family in northern England could differ noticeably from those eaten by a farming household in southern France or central Germany. Climate, soil, and local ecosystems influenced which crops grew reliably, and those crops inevitably formed the foundation of everyday meals. In colder and wetter regions of northern Europe, rye and oats were often more dependable than wheat. These grains tolerated harsh weather and poorer soil conditions, which made them ideal for small farmers who could not afford repeated crop failures. As a result, bread in these areas tended to be darker and heavier. Rye bread, in particular, became a staple for many communities, providing dense nutrition that could sustain long hours of labor. Oats also played an important role. Instead of bread, oats were frequently boiled into thick porridges that were eaten with milk, butter, or sometimes simply a bit of salt. This type of meal was filling, inexpensive, and quick to prepare. In Scotland and parts of northern England, oat-based dishes remained central to rural diets for centuries. Further south, where the climate was warmer and the growing season longer, wheat was easier to cultivate. This allowed more households to produce lighter bread made with finer flour. But even in these regions, wheat was not always guaranteed. Farmers still grew a mixture of grains to protect themselves against unpredictable weather. Barley, for example, was widely used not only for bread but also for brewing ale. The Mediterranean countryside added yet another layer of variety. In areas such as southern Italy or parts of Spain, olives and olive oil became essential ingredients. Olive oil provided fat for cooking and flavor for otherwise simple foods. Instead of butter or lard, peasants might drizzle olive oil over bread or vegetables. This difference in cooking fat created distinct regional food cultures, even though the broader pattern of grain-based meals remained the same. Vegetables also varied according to climate. Cabbages and hardy greens dominated colder regions because they could survive chilly conditions and store well. In warmer climates, peasants might grow a wider range of vegetables, including eggplants, onions, garlic, and leafy greens that thrived in longer growing seasons. Gardens were often small but carefully managed, producing the vegetables that gave daily meals their flavor and nutritional balance. Fruit occasionally supplemented the diet as well. Apples, pears, plums, and berries appeared when in season, though they were not always eaten fresh. Many fruits were dried or preserved to extend their usefulness beyond harvest time. Dried fruit could be added to certain dishes or eaten as a small treat during winter months. Despite these regional differences, the overall structure of the peasant diet remained surprisingly consistent. Grain still dominated the plate, vegetables filled the cooking pot, and animal products appeared in smaller quantities depending on resources. The variations were subtle but meaningful, shaped by centuries of adaptation to local environments. Trade networks also played a modest role, though far less dramatically than in later centuries. Salt, for instance, was one of the few widely traded necessities. Without salt, preserving meat and fish would have been far more difficult. Regions located near salt mines or coastal evaporation sites had easier access, while inland villages sometimes relied on merchants to bring it from distant areas. Occasionally, small luxuries traveled through these same networks. Honey might be traded between regions where beekeeping was common and areas where it was less practical. Spices existed in medieval Europe as well, though they were usually expensive and rarely found in peasant kitchens. When spices did appear, it was often during special celebrations or through rare opportunities rather than everyday cooking. All of this reminds us that peasant diets were local systems first and foremost. While kings and merchants might participate in long-distance trade, the majority of rural families relied on what their immediate surroundings could provide. The fields, forests, rivers, and gardens around a village defined what food was available each day. This strong connection to place also meant that knowledge of the land was essential. Peasants understood which crops grew best in particular soils, when wild plants could be safely gathered, and how seasonal weather patterns influenced planting and harvest. These insights were not written in books but passed from one generation to the next through observation and experience. And so the daily bowl of porridge in Scotland, the rye bread of northern Germany, or the olive oil-soaked vegetables of Mediterranean villages were all expressions of the same underlying truth. Peasant food was shaped by necessity, by environment, and by generations of practical wisdom. When we step back and look at the full picture, the meals themselves may appear modest. But behind each loaf of bread or pot of stew was an entire system of agriculture, climate knowledge, preservation techniques, and community cooperation. Those ordinary meals, repeated quietly day after day, were the foundation that allowed rural societies to survive, grow, and support the larger civilizations built above them. If we look even closer at the everyday meals of peasants, another important theme begins to appear: the constant balance between nutrition and survival. Medieval peasants did not think about food in terms of modern dietary science, but their choices were shaped by a deep practical understanding of what allowed a person to continue working through long, demanding days. Farming required strength and endurance, and meals had to provide enough energy to sustain that labor. Grain was central precisely because it provided a large number of calories in a form that could be stored and prepared efficiently. A bowl of barley porridge or a thick slice of rye bread might not seem impressive to modern tastes, but it delivered the carbohydrates necessary for people who spent most of their lives performing physical tasks. Plowing fields, cutting hay, carrying wood, repairing tools, and tending animals all required constant energy. Food had to support this work, and grain did that reliably. But peasants also understood that grain alone was not enough. The addition of vegetables, legumes, and occasional animal products created meals that were more balanced, even if the people preparing them would not have described them in those terms. Beans and peas contributed protein, vegetables supplied vitamins, and small amounts of dairy or meat added fats that helped make food more satisfying. This balance often appeared most clearly in the daily pot of pottage. A typical pottage might begin with water or broth, into which grain or crushed barley was added. Vegetables such as cabbage, onions, or leeks could follow. If the household had dried peas or beans available, these might be included as well. Occasionally, a small piece of salted pork or bacon might be dropped into the pot, giving the entire mixture a deeper flavor. The result was a thick stew that could feed several people and provide the nutrients necessary for continued work. The beauty of pottage was its flexibility. No fixed recipe existed. Each household prepared it according to what was available at the moment. During times of abundance, the stew might be richer and thicker, filled with vegetables and perhaps bits of meat. During leaner months, it could become thinner, relying mostly on grain and whatever greens could be gathered from the garden or nearby fields. Food also played an important role in maintaining social cooperation within rural communities. Farming was rarely an individual effort. Many tasks required the assistance of neighbors, especially during planting and harvest seasons when timing was critical. Shared labor was often accompanied by shared meals. After a long day of harvesting grain or bringing in hay, families might gather to eat together with bread, stew, and ale passed among the group. These gatherings strengthened relationships that were essential for survival. When one household faced hardship, perhaps a poor harvest or illness, neighbors sometimes offered assistance in the form of food or labor. Such support systems were not guaranteed, but they were an important part of village life. In small communities where everyone depended on the same land, cooperation helped reduce risk. Children grew up learning these patterns from an early age. Young members of the household helped with tasks such as grinding grain, collecting vegetables from the garden, or carrying water for cooking. By observing the preparation of daily meals, they gradually learned how ingredients were combined and how food supplies were managed throughout the year. Grinding grain itself was an important step in food preparation. Grain harvested from the fields had to be milled into flour before it could become bread or porridge. In many villages, this work took place at a mill powered by water or wind. Often the mill was owned by the local lord, and peasants were required to bring their grain there for grinding, paying a portion of the flour as a fee. This arrangement reminds us that even the most basic food, bread, was connected to broader economic and social systems. Once flour returned to the household, it could be transformed into dough, baked into loaves, or boiled into porridge. Each of these methods stretched the value of the grain harvest. Families had to think months ahead, carefully measuring how much grain could be consumed without exhausting the supply before the next harvest arrived. Occasionally, small treats appeared in the peasant diet, though they were rare compared with everyday staples. Honey was one of the most common natural sweeteners available in medieval Europe. Beekeeping existed in many rural areas, and honey could be used to sweeten certain foods or drinks. It was not consumed daily by most peasants, but when it appeared, it offered a welcome contrast to the usual flavors of grain and vegetables. These small moments of sweetness remind us that even within a diet focused on survival, people still valued enjoyment and comfort. Food was not only fuel, it was part of human experience, tied to celebration, family, and tradition. When historians piece together these details from records, archaeological evidence, and agricultural studies, a fuller picture emerges. The peasant diet was not simply poor or monotonous, as it is sometimes imagined. Instead, it was a carefully managed system shaped by environment, labor demands, and community cooperation. Day after day, year after year, millions of peasants relied on this system to sustain their lives. Their meals may have been humble, but they were remarkably resilient, built from ingredients and practices that allowed rural societies to endure across centuries. Another important dimension of the peasant diet becomes clear when we examine how scarcity shaped everyday thinking about food. For most rural households in the medieval world, the question was rarely about choosing between many options. Instead, the central concern was how to ensure that the available food supply lasted long enough to reach the next harvest. This constant awareness influenced how ingredients were stored, cooked, and distributed within the household. Grain storage was especially critical. After the harvest, sacks or bins of grain represented the family's security for the coming year. Each portion removed from storage meant that slightly less remained for the months ahead. Because of this, peasants often developed a careful rhythm of consumption. Immediately after harvest, food might feel plentiful. Bread could be larger, porridge thicker, and meals slightly more generous. But as winter passed and spring approached, the same families often began to measure portions more cautiously. This slow tightening of resources explains why the early spring months were sometimes remembered as the most difficult period of the year. The previous harvest stores were shrinking, yet the new crops were not ready. Gardens were only beginning to produce fresh greens, and many preserved foods had already been used. During this time, households relied heavily on whatever remained in storage, usually grains and dried legumes, while supplementing their meals with the earliest edible plants appearing in fields and forests. Wild plants played a surprisingly important role during these moments of scarcity. Knowledge of edible greens, roots, and herbs could make a meaningful difference. Nettles, for example, were widely gathered and cooked like spinach. Sorrel leaves added a sour flavor to soups and stews. Even young shoots of certain plants could be boiled and eaten. These wild foods did not replace staple crops, but they provided valuable nutrition at times when cultivated foods were limited. Woodland areas also contributed small but meaningful additions to the peasant diet. In regions where forests were accessible, people gathered nuts such as hazelnuts or chestnuts. Chestnuts, in particular, were important in some parts of Europe because they could be dried and ground into flour. This chestnut flour sometimes appeared in breads or porridges, especially in mountainous areas where traditional grain farming was more difficult. Another seasonal resource came from fruit trees. Apples and pears were common in many rural landscapes. While fresh fruit was enjoyed when available, much of the harvest was preserved. Apples could be dried into slices that lasted through winter. In some places, apples were also fermented into cider, creating a drink that could be stored for long periods. These preserved fruits added variety to the otherwise grain-centered diet and provided small bursts of sweetness during colder months. Food scarcity also shaped household discipline around waste. Throwing away edible food was simply not an option. Leftover bread was never discarded. Instead, it might be soaked in broth, turned into a thicker stew, or used to feed animals that in turn contributed to the household economy. Vegetable scraps could become part of the next day's pottage. Bones from meat might be boiled repeatedly to extract every possible bit of flavor and nutrition. This careful use of resources reflects a broader pattern in peasant life. Survival depended on efficiency and foresight. Families had to think months ahead when deciding how much grain to grind into flour or how quickly to consume preserved foods. A mistake in judgment could have serious consequences later in the year. Yet despite these challenges, many peasant communities developed traditions that helped soften the harshest moments of scarcity. Seasonal festivals, often connected to the agricultural calendar, brought brief periods of shared celebration. After harvest, for example, villagers might gather for communal meals that included better bread, freshly prepared dishes, and occasionally meat. These gatherings allowed people to enjoy the fruits of their labor before returning to the careful management of stored food. Ale also remained an important part of everyday life during these cycles of abundance and scarcity. Because ale was brewed from grain, its production had to be balanced with the need to preserve grain for bread and porridge. But small-scale brewing offered several advantages. It provided hydration, added calories, and created a beverage that could be safely consumed throughout the day. Even children sometimes drank very weak ale, which contained far less alcohol than modern beers. Over time, these patterns created a diet that was remarkably resilient, even when conditions were difficult. The combination of grain, legumes, vegetables, preserved foods, and occasional animal products formed a flexible system capable of adapting to both good harvests and poor ones. When historians reconstruct what peasants ate daily, they are really uncovering a story of constant adaptation. Every meal was part of a larger strategy to survive changing seasons, unpredictable weather, and the demands of agricultural labor. The simple bowl of pottage or slice of coarse bread may appear modest today, but within the medieval world it represented careful planning, accumulated knowledge, and the steady effort of households determined to endure. And in those quiet routines, grinding grain, gathering greens, stirring the cooking pot, we glimpse the everyday resilience of the people who formed the backbone of medieval society. Another way to understand what peasants ate daily is to look at how closely food was tied to labor itself. For most rural families, eating and working were not separate parts of the day. Instead, meals were arranged around the demands of agricultural life. The rhythm of planting, tending crops, and harvesting shaped when people ate what they ate and how quickly food needed to be prepared. A typical workday for peasants often began very early, especially during the busy seasons of spring and summer. At dawn, before heading into the fields, people might eat a simple meal, sometimes just a piece of bread, perhaps with a bit of cheese or leftover pottage from the night before. This small meal provided enough energy to begin the morning's work without taking much time to prepare. The larger meal of the day usually came later, when labor paused briefly around midday. Workers might return home if the fields were close, or they might bring food with them to eat outdoors. Bread was particularly useful in this situation because it traveled easily and stayed edible for several days. A chunk of bread paired with onions, cheese, or a small portion of preserved meat could be eaten quickly before work resumed. Pottage also remained an important meal for the evening. After hours of physical effort, a warm bowl of stew provided comfort and nourishment. The pot simmering over the hearth would often be waiting when workers returned home. Families gathered around the fire, sharing the meal and discussing the day's work or plans for the following morning. Seasonal labor demands sometimes changed this routine dramatically. During harvest, for example, the entire community focused on bringing crops in as quickly as possible before weather could damage them. Harvest days were long and intense, often stretching from early morning until sunset. To sustain this effort, meals needed to be both filling and practical. Large quantities of bread and ale were commonly provided during harvest work because they could be distributed easily to many laborers. Pottage might also be prepared in larger pots to feed groups of workers. In some cases, households cooperated by preparing food for one another while others focused on the fields. This sharing of labor and meals helped ensure that the harvest could be completed efficiently. Haymaking and planting seasons required similar cooperation. When many hands were needed, neighbors often worked together, moving from one field to another across the village. Food accompanied this cooperation. After a long day of shared labor, it was common for workers to gather for a meal that, while still simple, felt more generous than the usual daily fare. Children and older family members also contributed to this cycle. While the strongest adults handled the heaviest tasks, younger or older household members might help prepare food, carry water, gather vegetables, or keep the cooking fire burning. In this way, the preparation of daily meals became part of the broader system of family labor. Food also had to be portable and durable, especially during long workdays away from home. Hard cheeses, dried fruits, and sturdy bread were ideal because they could be carried without spoiling quickly. Even small cloth bundles of beans or peas might be taken along to be added to a cooking pot later in the day. Ale served an important function here as well. Long hours of work under the sun required constant hydration, and weak ale offered a safe and nourishing drink. Because it contained calories from fermented grain, it provided both liquid and energy. Workers might drink it throughout the day while laboring in the fields. Another subtle but important aspect of daily food was the psychological comfort it provided. After exhausting physical labor, the familiarity of the evening meal offered a moment of rest and stability. Even if the ingredients rarely changed, the routine of sharing food with family created a sense of continuity in a life that was often uncertain. This connection between work and food reminds us that peasant meals were never isolated events. They were part of a larger system of survival, shaped by the demands of agriculture and the limits of available resources. Each loaf of bread, each pot of stew, represented not only nourishment but also the result of countless hours of labor in fields, gardens, and kitchens. When we picture medieval peasants eating their daily meals, it is helpful to imagine the entire cycle surrounding those moments. The early morning start, the long hours under open skies, the brief pause to eat bread and drink ale, and finally the return home to a warm bowl of pottage at day's end. Through these routines, repeated year after year, food sustained not only individual bodies but entire communities. It fueled the labor that planted crops, harvested grain, and maintained the agricultural foundation upon which medieval society depended. And in that quiet, steady relationship between work and nourishment, we see how something as simple as daily food carried the weight of an entire way of life. Another important element of the peasant diet becomes clearer when we look at how food was influenced by social structure and obligation. Medieval peasants did not live in isolation from the wider system of land ownership and authority. In many parts of Europe, peasants worked land that technically belonged to a lord. In exchange for using this land, they owed certain payments, rents, or labor services. These obligations often affected what food remained available for their own families. For example, a portion of the harvest might be owed as rent or tax. Grain, animals, or dairy products could be claimed by the landowner or by the church through tithes. This meant that the total amount of food produced in a village did not automatically belong to the people who grew it. A household might harvest several sacks of grain, yet still need to give part of that harvest away before calculating what remained for their own use. Because of this, peasants often had to plan their food supplies very carefully. After setting aside what was owed to the Lord or to the church, families then divided the remaining grain between several needs. Some grain had to be saved as seed for planting the following year. Another portion was kept for milling into flour for bread and porridge. Only after these necessities were considered could the household decide how much could be used more freely. Livestock could also be affected by these obligations. Certain animals might be taxed, and sometimes peasants were expected to provide goods such as eggs, chickens, or cheese as part of their dues. This meant that even when a family owned animals, the products from those animals might not always remain entirely within the household. Yet, despite these pressures, peasants developed remarkably efficient household systems for managing food. Gardens became especially valuable because they were usually controlled directly by the family. Within these small plots, peasants could grow vegetables that supplemented their grain-based diet without requiring large fields. Cabbage, onions, garlic, beans, and herbs were common choices because they grew reliably and provided important nutrients. Herbs deserve special mention here. While modern cooking often treats herbs as minor flavorings, medieval households valued them for several reasons. They improved the taste of otherwise simple meals, but they were also believed to have health benefits. Plants such as sage, parsley, thyme, and mint appeared frequently in kitchen gardens. Even if only small amounts were used in cooking, they helped transform basic pottage into something more enjoyable. Another interesting feature of the peasant diet was the limited but meaningful role of markets. Although most food was produced locally, villages were not completely isolated. Weekly or seasonal markets allowed peasants to trade goods with nearby communities. A household might bring eggs, vegetables, or small crafted items to market and exchange them for foods they could not easily produce themselves. Salt, again, was one of the most common market purchases because of its importance in preserving meat and fish. In some regions, peasants might also buy dried fish, particularly during periods when religious fasting required alternatives to meat. Occasionally small luxuries appeared as well, perhaps a bit of honey, a rare spice, or a better quality loaf of bread. However, these market purchases were usually modest. Most peasants did not have large amounts of money to spend, so trade was often limited to essential items or occasional treats. the majority of daily meals still relied on food grown or prepared within the household. Food preparation also reflected this careful use of resources. Cooking pots were often kept simmering for long periods, allowing ingredients to stretch further. Leftovers were rarely wasted. Bread that had grown stale could be softened in broth or used to thicken stews. Vegetable trimmings might be added to the next pot of pottage. Even small scraps of meat were valued for the flavor they could contribute to a large dish shared by several people. These habits reveal something important about medieval peasant life. Resourcefulness was essential. Every ingredient carried value because it represented time, labor, and the uncertainty of future harvests. Waste was not simply careless. It could threaten the household's ability to endure the coming months. Despite these constant pressures, peasant communities still found moments of comfort in food. Family meals at the end of a long day created a sense of stability. Seasonal celebrations allowed people to enjoy slightly richer dishes. And the familiar combination of bread, vegetables, legumes, and ale provided a dependable foundation for daily life. When historians study the food of peasants, they often discover that these meals tell a much larger story. They reveal how rural families navigated economic obligations, environmental challenges, and the demands of agricultural labor. The simple dishes that appeared on peasant tables were shaped by all of these forces at once. In the end, the daily diet of peasants was not defined by luxury or variety. It was defined by balance, discipline, and adaptation. Through careful planning and shared knowledge, rural households transformed limited ingredients into meals that sustained entire communities across generations. And within those quiet routines of cooking and eating, the foundations of medieval society continued day after day, year after year. As we continue exploring what peasants ate each day, another important element emerges: the influence of the household itself as the center of food production. In the medieval countryside, the home was not just a place to sleep or rest. It was a small working environment where food was grown, prepared, stored, and managed with careful attention. Almost every member of the family contributed in some way to the process that eventually produced the daily meal. The kitchen space in a peasant home was usually simple, often little more than the open hearth area where cooking took place. Yet around that hearth revolved an entire system of tasks. Grain needed to be cleaned and sometimes ground into flour. Vegetables from the garden had to be washed and chopped. Beans or peas might be soaked before cooking. Even collecting water from nearby wells or streams was a daily responsibility that made meal preparation possible. Women often carried the primary responsibility for managing these food-related tasks, though in rural life the roles of men, women, and children frequently overlapped depending on circumstances. Preparing food required not only time but also experience. Knowing how long to boil dried legumes, how to balance ingredients in a stew, or how to judge the freshness of stored food were all practical skills passed down through generations. One of the most important household responsibilities was maintaining the supply of preserved foods. Because fresh ingredients were not always available, especially during winter months, families relied heavily on foods prepared earlier in the year. Vegetables might be dried or fermented, meat carefully salted and smoked, and fruits preserved through drying or simple storage methods. Cabbage, for instance, was especially valued because it could be kept for long periods in cool storage areas. When fermented, it produced a tangy preserved food that could last even longer. Similarly, root vegetables such as turnips could be stored in cellars or underground pits where the temperature remained stable. These preserved foods often appeared in the daily pot of stew when fresh ingredients were scarce. Grain storage required constant attention as well. Moisture, insects, and rodents all posed serious threats to stored grain. Families kept grain in sacks or wooden containers raised slightly above the ground to reduce these risks. Protecting these supplies was essential because grain represented the foundation of daily meals for months at a time. Another aspect of the peasant diet that deserves attention is the role of flavor and small comforts. Although peasant food is sometimes imagined as bland, many households used simple techniques to improve taste. Onions, garlic, and leeks were especially popular because they grew easily and added strong flavor to stews and broths. Even a small amount of these ingredients could transform a pot of grain and vegetables into something more satisfying. Herbs from the garden also helped provide variety. Plants like parsley, sage, thyme, and mint were valued not only for their flavor but also for their reputation as helpful remedies for minor ailments. Medieval households often believed that certain herbs aided digestion or strengthened the body, so adding them to food served both culinary and practical purposes. Salt remained one of the most valuable seasonings. While it was essential for preserving food, it also improved the taste of everyday meals. A pinch of salt in a pot of beans or vegetables could make a simple dish far more enjoyable. Because salt sometimes had to be purchased from markets or traders, families used it carefully, measuring its use across the year. In addition to flavorings, small sources of fat were highly prized. Fat provided energy and made food feel more filling. Lard from pigs, butter from dairy animals, or occasionally olive oil in southern regions could be added to cooking pots. Even small amounts enriched otherwise simple meals and helped sustain people through demanding physical work. Another subtle but meaningful aspect of daily eating was the emotional rhythm created by meals. After hours of labor in fields or gardens, gathering around the hearth for a warm bowl of food offered a sense of stability. The ingredients might change slightly with the seasons, but the pattern remained familiar. Bread was broken, stew was shared, and family members spent a few quiet moments together before the next day's work began. These routines created traditions that stretched across generations. Children learned not only how to prepare food, but also how to manage limited resources, respect seasonal rhythms, and cooperate with others in the household. The daily meal became part of a much larger system of knowledge about land, weather, animals, and community. When historians look closely at these details, they often discover that peasant diets were remarkably adaptable. The same basic structure, grain, vegetables, legumes, and occasional animal products, could adjust to different climates, harvest conditions, and economic pressures. This flexibility allowed rural populations to survive through both prosperous years and difficult ones. In many ways, the daily food of peasants represents a quiet form of resilience. Without modern technology, refrigeration, or global trade networks, these communities still managed to feed themselves through careful planning and cooperation. Their meals were shaped by necessity, but they were also shaped by experience and tradition. And so when we imagine the medieval peasant sitting down to eat, we should picture far more than a simple bowl of stew. As we move further into the daily realities of peasant food, one more important idea begins to stand out. Food was deeply tied to time itself. Not simply the seasons of the year, but the passing of generations. The meals peasants prepared were rarely invented suddenly or changed quickly. Instead, they were the result of traditions that had developed slowly, shaped by long experience with land, climate, and survival. Recipes, in the modern sense, were almost never written down in peasant households. Instead, knowledge passed through observation and repetition. A child growing up in a rural home would see the same dishes prepared over and over again. They would watch grain being ground into flour, see vegetables chopped and added to a simmering pot, and learn how long different foods needed to cook. Over time, these repeated actions became instinctive. Because of this, cooking was not seen as a separate craft the way it might be in wealthy kitchens. In noble households, trained cooks might experiment with elaborate recipes or imported spices. But in peasant homes, the goal was reliability. Meals had to work with the ingredients available and the tools at hand. Consistency mattered more than novelty. The daily pot of pottage perfectly illustrates this approach. One generation might prepare it almost exactly the same way as the generation before. Grain formed the base, vegetables provided flavor and nutrients, and whatever protein was available, beans, peas, or a bit of preserved meat, completed the dish. Over time, families learned which combinations worked best, which ingredients stretched the meal further, and which methods saved precious fuel while cooking. Fuel itself was an important limitation. Firewood had to be gathered from nearby woodland or collected from hedgerows and fields. Because gathering would require time and effort, cooking methods favored long, slow simmering rather than many separate dishes. A single pot over the hearth used fuel efficiently and could feed the entire household. Another quiet influence on the peasant diet was weather and climate variation from year to year. While the general rhythm of agriculture followed predictable seasons, each year still brought its own conditions. A summer with too much rain might damage grain crops. A sudden frost could harm vegetables in gardens. In such situations, families had to adjust quickly. If grain harvests were smaller than expected, households might rely more heavily on legumes such as peas or beans. These plants sometimes handled difficult conditions better than certain grains and could provide a backup food source. Similarly, root vegetables like turnips often survived harsher weather and could help fill gaps in the food supply. Livestock also offered some flexibility during difficult seasons. Chickens continued laying eggs, goats or cows provided milk when healthy, and pigs could convert scraps and forest foods into meat. While these animals were valuable and not slaughtered lightly, they provided important layers of security within the household economy. Communities also developed collective strategies to handle unpredictable conditions. Villagers often shared knowledge about planting times, crop varieties, and weather patterns. Experienced farmers might recognize early signs of trouble in a field and adjust planting methods the following year. These shared observations slowly improved farming practices across generations. Food preservation methods also helped protect against uncertainty. Smoking meat, drying grains, fermenting vegetables, and storing roots in cool cellars all served the same purpose, extending the usefulness of food beyond the moment it was harvested. Without these methods, even a good harvest would quickly spoil. Interestingly, some preserved foods developed flavors that people came to enjoy rather than simply tolerate. Fermented cabbage, smoked pork, and aged cheeses could add distinctive tastes to otherwise simple meals. These foods were not merely emergency supplies. They became familiar parts of the regional diet. Another important aspect of peasant food was the role of modest pleasure. Even in a life focused on labor and survival, people still valued moments of enjoyment. A particularly fresh loaf of bread after harvest, a stew enriched with a bit of bacon, or fruit gathered at the peak of summer could feel like small celebrations. Seasonal festivals often amplified these moments. Harvest festivals, religious celebrations, and weddings provided opportunities for richer meals. For a brief time, the ordinary pattern of food expanded. Meat might appear more generously, bread could be made with better flour, and sweet foods prepared with honey might be shared among neighbors. These events mattered because they reminded people that food was not only about survival. It was also about community, memory, and shared experience. A festive meal strengthened bonds within the village and offered relief from the constant focus on careful resource management. Yet after the celebration ended, daily life returned to its steady rhythm. The hearth fire burned again, the pot of pottage simmered, and bread was broken around the family table. The same ingredients appeared again and again, but they carried the quiet stability that rural life depended on. When historians reconstruct the diets of peasants, they often discover that the real story is not about a single meal or ingredient. It is about continuity, the same foods, the same cooking methods, and the same patterns of eating sustained communities for centuries. As we continue exploring the everyday food of peasants, another quiet but important influence begins to appear: the relationship between land ownership and access to food resources. For many medieval peasants, survival depended not only on the crops they grew but also on the surrounding landscape. Fields, forests, rivers, and common lands that offered additional sources of nourishment. In many villages, certain lands were shared by the community. These areas, often called common lands, allowed peasants to graze animals, gather firewood, and sometimes collect wild foods. While the primary harvest still came from cultivated fields, these shared resources helped support the household diet in subtle but meaningful ways. Forests, for example, could provide nuts, berries, mushrooms, and edible plants. Hazelnuts were especially valuable in many regions because they contained fats and nutrients that were otherwise difficult to obtain. In some places, chestnuts were even more important. Large chestnut trees produced abundant harvests, and the nuts could be dried and ground into flour. In mountainous parts of Europe, chestnut flour sometimes became a significant supplement to grain-based foods. Woodlands also supported pig raising through a practice often known as pannage. During certain times of the year, pigs were allowed to roam through forests to feed on fallen acorns, nuts, and other natural foods. This system allowed households to raise animals without using valuable grain supplies. When autumn arrived, well-fed pigs could be slaughtered, providing meat that would be preserved for winter months. Rivers and streams also contributed quietly to the peasant diet. Fishing offered an additional source of protein, especially in communities located near reliable waterways. Even small fish could be added to stews or eaten roasted over a fire. In some cases, simple fish traps made from woven branches allowed people to catch fish without constant supervision. However, access to these natural resources was not always completely free. In many regions, local lords controlled forests and waterways, and peasants were required to follow specific rules about hunting, gathering, or fishing. Hunting large game such as deer was often reserved for the nobility, meaning that peasants rarely had access to these animals. Because of these restrictions, peasant diets depended far more on domesticated animals and plant-based foods. Chickens, eggs, milk, and preserved pork remained far more common than wild meat. Yet even within these limits, rural communities found ways to use the environment around them efficiently. Another subtle feature of peasant food was its connection to long-term environmental knowledge. Generations of farmers observed how certain crops behaved in different soils or climates. They learned which plants survived drought conditions, which vegetables could tolerate cold weather, and which crops produced the most reliable harvests. This knowledge shaped what peasants planted year after year. Crops like rye, barley, and oats remained popular because they could survive in difficult conditions. Hardy vegetables such as cabbage and onions became staples because they grew well in many climates and could be stored for long periods. Crop rotation also played a role in maintaining soil fertility. Farmers often divided fields into sections where different crops were planted in sequence across multiple years. One field might grow grain while another rested or grew legumes that restored nutrients to the soil. This approach helped maintain productivity without modern fertilizers. Food preparation then reflected the results of this agricultural system. When harvests were strong, pottage might include a generous mixture of vegetables and legumes. When crops were weaker, the same dish might rely more heavily on grain and preserved foods. The flexibility of peasant cooking allowed households to adapt without dramatically changing their eating habits. Ale production also continued to play a significant role in this system. Brewing allowed surplus grain to be turned into a drink that stored well and provided hydration during work. Small-scale brewing took place regularly within villages, and weak ale often appeared on the table alongside bread and stew. Even though the diet may appear repetitive from a modern perspective, peasants likely experienced subtle variations across the year. Fresh vegetables in summer, preserved meats in winter, new bread after harvest, and dried fruits during colder months all added changes to the routine. These variations created a sense of seasonal rhythm within daily meals. People could taste the progress of the year in the foods available to them. The arrival of new onions in spring, the abundance of fresh vegetables in summer, or the richer meals following autumn slaughter all signaled shifts in the agricultural cycle. And this connection between food and landscape reveals something essential about peasant life. Their diet was not created by distant markets or global trade routes. It grew directly from the land surrounding their homes. Fields, gardens, forests, and rivers all contributed pieces of the daily meal. In that sense, the food peasants ate each day was more than nourishment. It was a reflection of their environment and their long relationship with it. Every loaf of bread carried the story of soil and weather. Every bowl of stew reflected generations of knowledge about how to turn simple ingredients into sustaining meals. Through these quiet practices, planting, gathering, preserving, and cooking, peasant communities created a food culture rooted deeply in the land itself. As we come toward the final layers of understanding what peasants ate daily, it is worth stepping back and looking at how surprisingly stable the peasant diet remained across centuries. While kings, borders, and political systems changed frequently in medieval Europe, the daily food of rural people evolved very slowly. The basic structure of meals, grain, vegetables, legumes, small amounts of animal products, and ale remained consistent for generations. This stability came largely from necessity. Agricultural technology improved only gradually, and most farming continued to rely on simple tools such as wooden plows, hand sickles, and animal power. Because productivity was limited, peasants depended on crops that were dependable rather than experimental. If a crop had fed a village for decades without failing, it was likely to remain the foundation of future harvests. Grain therefore stayed at the center of daily eating. Whether in the form of bread, porridge, or pottage, grain provided the calories that made sustained labor possible. Fields were carefully planted, tended, and harvested to ensure that enough grain was produced not only for immediate consumption, but also for storage through the winter months. Vegetables from household gardens formed the second pillar of the peasant diet. These gardens might appear small by modern standards, but they were carefully organized spaces that produced a steady flow of useful ingredients. Cabbage, onions, beans, peas, and herbs could all grow in relatively compact plots. Because gardens were close to the home, they were easy to maintain and harvest throughout the growing season. Legumes such as peas and beans held particular importance because they added protein to meals that otherwise relied heavily on grains. Dried legumes could be stored for long periods and rehydrated when needed. When cooked together with vegetables and grains, they produced meals that were filling and nutritionally balanced. Animal products remained valuable but were usually consumed sparingly. Eggs might appear regularly if chickens were kept successfully. Dairy products such as milk, butter, or cheese were available in households with cows or goats. Meat, however, often appeared only occasionally, typically after autumn slaughter or during special events. Even when meat was present, it was used carefully. A small piece of salted pork added to a stew could flavor an entire pot that fed several people. This efficient use of meat allowed families to stretch limited supplies over many meals. The importance of food preservation cannot be overstated in this system. Without reliable methods of storage, the harvest would spoil long before winter ended. Drying grains and legumes was relatively simple, but vegetables and meat required more careful treatment. Smoking, salting, and fermenting helped extend the life of foods that would otherwise spoil quickly. These preservation techniques also created distinctive regional flavors. Smoked meats, fermented vegetables, and aged cheeses developed tastes that became part of local culinary traditions. What began as a survival strategy gradually shaped the character of rural cooking in different regions. Ale continued to serve as a dependable daily drink. Because brewing required grain, it was carefully balanced with other household needs. Weak ale was common, providing hydration and energy during long workdays. In many villages, brewing was done at home or in small community batches. One of the most striking aspects of the peasant diet is how little waste it allowed. Every edible resource was valued. Leftover bread might be softened in broth. Vegetable scraps could be added to the next pot of stew. Bones from meat were boiled repeatedly to extract flavor. Even peels and husks sometimes found their way into animal feed, ensuring that nothing useful was discarded. This careful attitude toward food reflected the constant awareness that resources were limited. A poor harvest, illness within the household, or unexpected weather could quickly place a family at risk. By using every ingredient fully, peasants increased their chances of making their supplies last until the next successful harvest. And yet, despite these constant challenges, peasant meals were not defined only by scarcity. There was also a quiet rhythm and familiarity in daily eating. The smell of bread baking in a communal oven, the steady simmer of stew over the hearth, and the shared moment of sitting down together after a long day of work created a sense of continuity in village life. Food became part of the cultural memory of rural communities. Recipes were rarely written down, but they lived in the habits of families. Children watched their parents cook and gradually absorbed the knowledge themselves. In this way, the patterns of daily eating passed smoothly from one generation to the next. When historians reconstruct these meals today, they reveal more than a list of ingredients. They reveal a system of life built around land, labor, and cooperation. The simple foods eaten by peasants were not the result of neglect or lack of imagination. They were the result of careful adaptation to an environment where survival required discipline and experience. So when we think about what peasants ate daily, the answer is both simple and profound. Bread, pottage, vegetables, beans, occasional dairy, small portions of preserved meat, and cups of ale sustained millions of people across medieval Europe. These foods were modest, but they carried within them the knowledge, effort, and resilience of generations who depended on them. As we reflect further on the daily meals of peasants, it becomes clear that food also played a quiet role in shaping community identity. Even though peasant diets were built from practical necessities, they still carried subtle traditions that varied from village to village. These traditions were not written in cookbooks, but they lived in habits, small choices about ingredients, preparation, and seasonal customs that were passed down over time. For instance, the way bread was prepared could differ across regions. In some areas, households favored thicker, denser loaves made from rye flour, which held moisture well and stayed edible for several days. In other regions where wheat was easier to grow, bread might be lighter and slightly softer. These differences were often shaped by the soil and climate, but they gradually became part of local identity. A traveler moving from one region to another might notice that the bread tasted different, even though the basic idea of bread remained the same. The same could be said for pottage. While the structure of the dish was consistent, a simmering mixture of grains, vegetables, and sometimes legumes, the exact combination of ingredients changed according to what grew best locally. In a northern village, the stew might contain cabbage, barley, and peas. In a southern community, onions, beans, and herbs might dominate the pot. Over generations, these variations created distinctive local flavors even within a diet that seemed simple from a distance. Food preparation also reflected shared knowledge within the village. Certain individuals became known for their skill in baking, brewing, or preserving food. A neighbor might be especially good at fermenting cabbage or curing meat, and others might seek advice or help when preparing their own supplies. These exchanges strengthened community ties and helped maintain important skills. The communal oven is a good example of how food preparation could become a social event. When several families brought their dough to the oven for baking, people naturally spent time together while waiting. Conversations about weather, crops, family news, or upcoming festivals often took place during these moments. The simple act of baking bread thus reinforced the social fabric of village life. Another interesting detail about the peasant diet is how taste preferences slowly evolved through necessity. Because preserved foods were so common during winter, people became accustomed to flavors that modern diners might find strong or unusual. Fermented vegetables, smoked meats, and aged cheeses created bold tastes that balanced the otherwise mild flavor of grains. Salt and smoke, for example, were not just preservation techniques. They became defining characteristics of many traditional foods. The smoky flavor of cured pork or the tang of fermented cabbage added depth to simple meals. Over time, these tastes became familiar and even comforting. Sweetness, on the other hand, was much rarer in the peasant diet. Honey was the most common sweetener available, but it was still relatively limited compared with modern sugar supplies. When honey appeared in a dish or drink, it could make the occasion feel special. Certain festive foods might include honey, dried fruits, or richer grains, creating a noticeable contrast with everyday fare. Seasonal celebrations often highlighted these rare ingredients. During major religious holidays such as Christmas or Easter, families sometimes prepared foods that they did not eat regularly throughout the year. Bread might be made from finer flour, stews might include larger portions of meat, and sweet dishes could appear on the table. These meals were not extravagant by noble standards, but for peasants they represented welcome moments of abundance. These festivals also reinforced the connection between food and the agricultural calendar. After harvest, when grain stores were freshly filled and animals had been slaughtered for winter, villages sometimes held communal gatherings that included shared meals. These events marked the successful completion of months of labor and allowed people to enjoy the fruits of their work together. Despite these occasional celebrations, the daily routine soon returned to its familiar pattern. Bread, pottage, vegetables, and ale once again formed the core of everyday meals. This repetition might seem monotonous from a modern perspective, but for medieval peasants it offered reassurance. Familiar foods meant stability. As long as the household could maintain these basic meals, survival was likely. What makes the peasant diet remarkable is not its variety but its durability. Over centuries of shifting politics and changing economies, the same basic foods continued to nourish rural populations. The ingredients were simple, but they were dependable. And within those simple meals lived generations of experience. Knowledge about planting crops, storing food, managing resources, and cooperating within a community. Each bowl of stew and each loaf of bread represented the combined efforts of farmers, families, and neighbors working together to sustain life. In the end, the daily food of peasants tells a story that is both humble and powerful. It reminds us that history is not only shaped by rulers or armies, but also by the quiet routines of ordinary people. The steady preparation of meals, repeated day after day, created the foundation upon which entire societies were built. And in those humble kitchens, beside hearth fires, around communal ovens, and in small garden plots, peasants quietly maintained the rhythm of life that sustained the medieval world. As we reach the final reflections on what peasants ate each day, it helps to see the peasant diet not simply as a list of foods, but as a complete system of survival shaped by land, labor, and time. Every loaf of bread, every bowl of pottage, and every preserved vegetable was connected to months of careful work and planning. The daily meal was the visible result of an entire agricultural cycle that began long before the food ever reached the cooking pot. The cycle started in the fields. Planting grain required preparing soil, guiding animals that pulled the plow, scattering seed by hand, and wading through uncertain weather. Weeks and months passed before the first signs of harvest appeared. During that time, families relied on the food already stored from previous seasons. This meant that the success of a future meal depended on decisions made months earlier: how much grain had been planted, how carefully the previous harvest had been stored, and how wisely supplies had been used through the winter. When harvest finally arrived, it was one of the most critical moments in the peasant year. Entire villages worked together cutting grain with sickles, gathering the stalks into bundles, and carrying them to be threshed and stored. The harvest determined whether the coming months would be comfortable or difficult. A strong harvest meant fuller bread loaves and thicker stews. A weak harvest meant careful rationing and the constant effort to stretch supplies. Once grain was safely stored, it gradually moved through several stages before becoming food. Some was taken to mills where heavy stones ground it into flour. This flour then returned to households where it was turned into dough for bread or boiled into porridge. Each step required labor, and each step transformed the grain into something closer to the meal shared around the hearth. Vegetables from the garden followed their own rhythm. Seeds were planted in spring, tended through summer, and harvested as they matured. Some vegetables were eaten fresh, adding welcome variety to daily meals. Others were stored or preserved so that they could continue feeding the household through colder months. In this way, gardens acted as a steady companion to the larger grain fields. Livestock fit into the system as both helpers and food sources. Oxen pulled plows. Cows or goats provided milk. Chickens laid eggs. Pigs turned scraps and forest foods into meat that could be preserved for winter. These animals were rarely slaughtered casually because their ongoing contributions were often more valuable than a single meal. But when animals were eventually used for food, their meat was carefully prepared so that none of it was wasted. Cooking then brought all these elements together. Over the hearth fire, grains, vegetables, and legumes blended into the familiar stew that defined daily eating. Bread baked in communal ovens returned to the household table. Ale brewed from grain provided a drink that was both nourishing and safe. What stands out most about this system is its resilience. Despite limited technology, uncertain weather, and heavy labor demands, peasant communities developed food traditions capable of sustaining millions of people. The meals themselves were modest, but the knowledge behind them was extensive. Generations learned how to plant crops that survive difficult climates, how to preserve food through long winters, and how to stretch limited resources without exhausting them. There was also a quiet dignity in these daily routines. After hours spent working in fields or gardens, families gathered in the evening around the hearth. A pot of stew simmered slowly, filling the small space with warmth and familiar smells. Bread was broken and shared, bowls were passed from hand to hand, and for a short time the demands of the day gave way to rest. These meals rarely appeared in written history, yet they were among the most important parts of medieval life. While chronicles often describe battles, kings, and political events, the survival of entire populations depended on something much quieter: the steady preparation of food. Through bread, pottage, vegetables, legumes, dairy, and occasional meat, peasants sustained themselves and the societies around them. Their diet was shaped by the land they worked, the animals they raised, the seasons they endured, and the traditions they inherited. And in the end, the answer to the simple question, "What did peasants eat daily?" reveals something deeper than ingredients. It reveals a way of life built on patience, cooperation, and constant adaptation. The food may have been humble, but it carried the weight of survival and the accumulated wisdom of generations. In that humble bowl of stew, simmering quietly over a hearth fire, we can glimpse the everyday foundation of the medieval world. Before we close our exploration of what peasants ate every day, it helps to pause and look at the broader meaning of those ordinary meals. When historians examine medieval diets, they are not only studying food. They are studying the quiet mechanics of how entire societies functioned. The daily meals of peasants formed the foundation that allowed everything else in medieval life to exist. Peasants made up the overwhelming majority of the population in most medieval regions. Their labor produced the grain, vegetables, and livestock that fed towns, monasteries, and noble households. Without the steady output of rural farms, markets would have been empty, armies could not have been supplied, and cities could not have grown. In that sense, the modest foods eaten in peasant homes were directly connected to the stability of the wider world. What is striking is how efficient the peasant food system was, even with limited technology. Farming tools were simple, transportation was slow, and storage methods required constant attention. Yet rural communities still managed to produce enough food to sustain millions of people across large regions of Europe. This was possible because the system relied on crops and practices that had been tested over generations. Grain cultivation remained the backbone of this system. Wheat, rye, barley, and oats were planted because they could survive different climates and soils. When harvests succeeded, these grains provided the calories necessary for survival and labor. When harvests struggled, communities relied on preserved foods, legumes, and whatever the land could still offer. Gardens and small livestock created additional layers of security. A patch of cabbage, beans, and onions might seem small compared with large grain fields, but it provided important nutrients that grain alone could not supply. Chickens, goats, and pigs converted household scraps and natural forage into eggs, milk, and meat. Each element added resilience to the household diet. This system also depended heavily on shared knowledge within rural communities. Farming practices were rarely written down. Instead, they were passed through observation and memory. Farmers knew when to plant by watching the weather and the soil. They recognized which crops handled drought or cold more effectively. They understood how long preserved foods would last and how quickly supplies should be consumed. Food preparation followed this same tradition. Cooking methods were simple but refined through experience. Long simmering stews allowed tough ingredients to soften and flavors to blend. Baking bread in communal ovens ensured efficient use of fuel. Fermentation, smoking, and salting protected food supplies through winter months. Even though the diet may appear repetitive from a modern perspective, peasants likely experienced subtle variations that marked the progress of the year. The arrival of fresh greens in spring, the abundance of vegetables in summer, the richer foods after autumn harvest, and the preserved flavors of winter all created seasonal changes in daily meals. These shifts reminded people of their connection to the land. Food was not produced in distant factories or transported across continents. It came directly from fields, gardens, forests, and rivers that villagers knew intimately. Every meal carried the imprint of local soil, climate, and tradition. Another important feature of peasant meals was the sense of shared experience within the household. After long hours of work, gathering around the hearth for an evening meal offered a rare moment of rest. Bread and stew were passed between family members, and the warmth of the fire provided comfort during colder months. Children grew up surrounded by these routines. By watching older family members cook and manage food supplies, they learned the practical skills necessary for adulthood. Over time, these habits became part of the cultural identity of rural life. And so, when we imagine what peasants ate daily, we should not picture only hardship or monotony. Instead, we should see a system of remarkable balance. Grain provided energy, vegetables and legumes added nourishment, preserved foods extended the harvest, and small amounts of animal products enriched the diet when available. These meals were simple, but they were also sustainable. They allowed communities to endure through changing seasons, difficult harvests, and centuries of social transformation. The same foods that nourished one generation continued feeding the next. In many ways, the daily diet of peasants represents one of the most enduring patterns in human history. Long before modern agriculture and global food networks, rural families built systems capable of sustaining life using only the resources around them. And when we imagine that quiet scene, an evening hearth, a pot gently simmering, bread being broken and shared. We are witnessing something fundamental. Not just a meal, but the steady rhythm of survival that supported the medieval world, one humble dish at a time.